Great. Thanks, Alex. We've seen the world taken by storm, at least in the media, in terms of AI, Gen AI, and agentic AI over the past few years, especially agentic this past year. However, many organizations have struggled to move Gen AI into scaled implementations, and most importantly, have been challenged to demonstrate ROI from Gen AI investments. So given how powerful AI is and seemingly easy Gen AI is to prompt and get outputs, why are many companies struggling? One of the reasons is that there are certain foundational underpinnings that need to be in place in order to deploy Gen AI at scale and achieve and measure that benefit. Accuracy seems to be a major concern for C-suites in rolling out Gen AI at scale, and the probabilistic nature of AI creates a state that still leaves an uncertainty gap and can manifest itself in terms of hallucinations, errors, and incorrect context. So with that context and backdrop, I'd like to introduce our panel for this session, and let's go around the room here. Sonia, could you start us off?
Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Sonia Crosby. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer for QBE's Australia Pacific region. Our business is a pretty early adopter of GenAI, mostly in achieving workflow efficiencies, but we also have now some larger programs live to better support our claims and underwriting activities.
Thanks, Sonia. Mike, could you introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Michael Ross. I'm the Platform Product Manager for Eliza, which is BNY's AI platform. It serves not only to provide AI capabilities to approximately 98%, I believe, of our employee base now, but also serves as the bedrock on which we're able to build agentic and multi-agent solutions and provide that common pane of glass to be able to have the transparency and the trust that is required for scaled adoption.
Thanks. And last but not least, Jan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jan Neumann, and I lead the AI technologies team for Comcast Cable. We help the organization to leverage AI as a COE, focused on research, like looking around what's coming next, help desk and solution design functions, providing educations for making it easy for the company to adopt AI, as well as governance. And then we also try to make tangible impact with AI by building solutions and embedding our experts into the business, and finally figuring out how we can accelerate AI development and adoption using platforms that bridge any capability gaps that exist.
Thanks, Jan. And I'm Dr. John Ratson. I lead our data and AI for the financial services sector for Accenture. How are you each using, just name a couple of use cases where you're using Gen AI at your companies? Jan, let's start with you.
We're focusing on kind of like some of the use cases that probably a lot of companies start with. So specifically customer service, it's a natural application for Gen AI to make it more conversational. Another area is around marketing and sales, to look at how we can use generative AI to accelerate and kind of create better personalized solutions. And then finally, we are looking at generative AI in general to optimize kind of the workflows around our network and security offerings.
Sonia, you mentioned underwriting. Maybe elaborate a bit on what you're doing there with Gen AI.
Yeah, sure. Our underwriters receive enormous amounts of unstructured data, and they need to turn around and distill it and turn it around and associate it with our rules and risks very, very quickly. So we're using Gen AI to help triage those submissions and also to align it into our risk selection so that it's like an augmentation. The human is still making the decision, but it just actually cuts out a lot of the manual work for them.
Fantastic. And Mike, to round it out, what's the main application you're seeing with Gen AI at BNY?
We actually have a really broad array of different applications. To date, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 different applications that are using generative AI. Much like Jan, we saw a lot of early wins in marketing and sales, saw a lot of wins in terms of really empowering a lot of our more strategic or market analyst folks to do research and synthesis of data across many different fields. And then more recently, we're seeing a lot of success in using GenAI as a cleanup and enhancement step after typical data extraction. And then also in terms of automating some of our processes around automated repairs of messages that are coming in over the Swift network, and even more recently, software engineering tasks, being able to auto-generate code and close vulnerabilities.
Could you talk about how trust of data and AI is incorporated into your culture, some of the strategic investments, and just overall strategy? Jan, maybe we start with you this time.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the core questions that people often have, or is what's different with Gen AI and how do I evaluate it? Like traditionally, software is very deterministic, right? So once I test it, it will always behave the same. And one thing we already learned like 10 years ago when we built the Xfinity voice remote, that it was pretty hard to understand for people that you could fix certain errors, but then new errors would appear as you're retraining the model. And now we see with generative AI that that kind of complexity of knowing how well it works is really turned up to 11 in certain ways, right? Because the outputs are so much more complex, they're harder to evaluate. And like going beyond vibe checks to truly trust or build that trust in the applications is critical. There's a lot of excitement about the potential, and we see all the happy path. But as practitioners, we know that kind of the devil is in the long tail, right? And so that's kind of where evaluations really are absolutely necessary.
Mike, maybe over to you. How about trust and confidence?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd double down on some of Jan's comments in terms of the vitalness of evaluation. We've done some amount of investment in reusable evaluation frameworks, the infrastructure itself to be able to scale out evaluations across every use case that comes in. Also, we took a little bit of a strategy of building the control tower before any of the planes, and invested early on in building a lot of transparency, a lot of integration of our governance and risk mitigation lifecycle into the platform itself so that we can have that explainability and trust.
Sonia, anything to add there?
The cost of an error, it can be quite significant. To deliver exponentially more features means exponentially more risk if we don't manage it well. So we need to be able to evaluate at scale and at pace, but actually you also need to have tools that help you to evaluate quickly. We ask at the outset, are we doing the right thing? Is it providing a real benefit? How will we know? But when we're getting into AI on AI and agentic, who's marking your homework, who's observing, and so getting into some co-design and development with Snorkel on the model evaluation is really important to us, because we simply won't be able to do it in the way that we have been doing it over the last few years in an AI-only environment.
Well, let me start with the follow-up for you then, Sonia. What does good look like in this environment then? What are some of the underpinnings you need to have in place?
We have two top risks for AI. One is not doing it, and the other is not doing it well. Good looks like we meet our business objectives in a safe and sustainable way. And we know that when we implement these new tools and applications, they're not one and done. So you have to be able to keep on the pulse of it. So how do we think about that evidence of and defensibility so that we can say, yes, we know we've done the right thing. You know, we can look at ethical considerations from the outset, but then a lot of the conversation has been on explain the model. Well, it's very, very difficult to explain the model. You can explain the inputs, but actually does that tell you, what does that evidence for you? What we really need to be thinking about is evidencing the outputs and saying, well, is the model doing what it's intended to do? How can we show that we're doing the right thing by our customers? How do we know that we're winning? How do we know that it's actually doing as intended and delivering as intended? So how do we find the errors? How do we find the good stuff? That's what we're really grappling with now.
Well, how about Jan at Comcast? What does good look like for you guys?
I think there's the big gap that exists between, like, especially with LLMs, where like we all have the vibe that it looks good, even though like for the things that we don't see, it might not be as good. Like one thing that we're focusing a lot on is really extend the bias and fairness testing that we traditionally have applied to our more traditional machine learning models, and now extend it to the LLM outputs. How do they express things? How do they talk? How do they express certain concepts? How can we still capture those like more formal and important concepts in a scalable way, right? And so part of it is extensive human evaluations, putting the human in the loop
Hmm.
right before, especially it goes out to customers in general. And then seeing if from that observation, can we add additional like LLM as a judge or other criteria to kind of create early warning signs.
Fantastic. And for banks, in banking, Mike, anything specific in terms of what good might look like for a bank?
We very actively look at what the business impact is going to be, revenue, new revenue streams that we're opening up, cost efficiencies, just like everybody else. One thing that I think is probably a little discounted in a lot of those considerations about, the relative return is specifically risk reduction. So we have a lot of use cases that are specifically looking at, a sanction screening or something. So we are reducing the overall risk footprint. But then in a lot of cases, the arguments against automating a process tend to discount the risk that's already there from an operational point of view from human error. And so we're beginning to really take that into account so that we can say, yes, we are, potentially automating a process, introducing some additional risk, but let's take a really open-eyed look at the risk that we are replacing essentially and potentially
Yeah, especially in regulated industries, of course, the regulators are always looking for explainability, the magic word. And I liked what you said, Sonia, in terms of like, how do we measure the outputs, right? And because we might not be able to truly understand what's inside the opaque box. Each of you have mentioned AI eval, which maybe just a little more. Where do you see AI eval going? Mike, let's start with you.
I think you're seeing a lot of, I mentioned earlier, investment in the infrastructure and in the repeatable process around evaluations. But I think even the data itself, whether it's the tooling to collect the data meaningfully and in a high signal to noise fashion from either the solutions that they're running or the experts and the subject matter experts bring in their expertise. But we also look at using an iterative approach. So there are so many models out there, just even selecting that which foundation model do we use as the basis as a solution. We do use a lot of the open benchmarks. So Stanford Helm is one of our go-tos to even decide whether or not a model is worth bringing in to the sandbox area, like Jan mentioned, to evaluate. And then what we've seen, though, is that that is always the floor, not the ceiling. We really have to supplement that not only with data that is really tuned to the solution, but also that's relevant to BNY. So one of the provisions we get during model rollout is a beta period, where one of our primary risk mitigants is in just reducing the scope of people who can use it. And so even though we are running against production data, live data, potentially live use case, we have human in the loop, and that allows us to gather the real world feedback on the models, which then provides, that seed of data to feed forward into evaluation. And in addition to actively working with a lot of internal and external parties for red teaming, we're also beginning to see forward motion in using AI for red teaming. And so kind of in engaging that challenger model approach and having AI models actively go out and try to, find penetrations into the system.
Sonia, what's next in AI eval for you guys?
It's really getting beyond kind of your basics and into more contextual. So if we're looking at things like speed and completeness and accuracy, those are kind of like they're no-brainers, right?
Mhm.
But when we're starting to look at unstructured, we really want to look at in the moment, in the context, what should we be acting on? And sometimes these instruments are a bit blunt. So for example, somebody might be having a chat on an IVR around and complaining about a sports match. Well, that's not a complaint, but it is. So moving beyond transactional classification into more contextual is a big deal. A lot more test and learn, loads more test and learn, and really having sandpits and experimental spaces is key for that as well.
Mike, you mentioned open source benchmarks. Let me go to Jan. What's the future on these open source benchmarks?
Like we're looking at kind of at the open source benchmarks for general guidance of like how to do your high level model selection, and then complement that with internal benchmarks, right? And especially for more complex use cases, your internal use cases are still very different. And especially if you want to combine them with like additional information like that you have, like let's say customer data that you want to bring in, and that helps you understand like what the specific situation of a customer is if you want to help them. That's not something that you would find in public benchmarks. I mean, the other thing too, where we built on top of it is really focusing on user simulation, right? So again, which something is you don't find in open source. So like that has been a big research topic on our side of how we can use basically actual data that we have observations and simulate that to get a good understanding of the behavior of the system and a more complete understanding than we would get from open source benchmarks alone.
It is really about how do we take it to a much deeper level. Is the model actually performing as well or better than the human could?
Let me come back to you, Mike, in terms of just timeframes. What's your sense in terms of 12, 24 months? How much of the organization will be really leveraging that in the near term?
We already are heavy users of Gen AI solutions. As I mentioned, I think earlier, over 95% of our employees are actively using some of these tools, at least in a knowledge assistant kind of fashion. We are also already have started to deploy AI-based digital employees. So it's just a method of deploying some of these agent-based solutions to integrate with the systems that we have. And already, even in just less than a quarter of really having that construct and beginning to tie them into our systems as employees, we've seen huge growth. So I believe even by the end of the year, we're going to see very deep penetration across BNY. Industry-wide, I think probably a little slower.
And Jan, how about you?
I mean, 24 was the year of excitement about AI, right? 25 is kind of like the year of adoption and building the skills. And I would think like 26 is how the majority of our workforce will truly take advantage. I mean, we are currently doing a number of larger efforts around rethinking the software development lifecycle using AI.
And Sonia, how about you? Timeframes in terms of how much impact agentic's going to have?
It's massive. I think that what's shifting is what will quickly become commodity versus what's your point of difference. And, we're seeing that a lot of the buy versus build at the moment, it's too generic. The winners are going to pop out, and there's going to be an enormous amount of choice, which is really, really difficult to then distill quickly and keep on top of. And I think the realization that it's not just a standalone, that these things need to be integrated end to end, and there's a lot of business process change and people change that goes with it. So I think the reality check is kind of right here, right now. And I think the other thing that's coming our way is regulator interest. Absolutely.
Let me just go around with one more question is, what's just one thing that you think is really important to get right? Jan, let's start with you.
I mean, I think we already talked about kind of the need for evaluations. If you want to build production systems, you need to kind of really start with the evaluation, similar how we always said in software development, you should start with the unit tests and then develop against them. So I think that the equivalent is really starting with evaluations.
Sonia, what's one thing important to get right in your view?
Asking the right question and knowing that you've actually got an answer that works. We waste an awful lot of time asking not so good questions. And in any business, you need to know what is the problem you're trying to solve? What question are you actually asking that will help you understand that better? And then how do you know? And we can spend an awful lot of time going around in circles if we don't get that clear at the beginning. So I think that's a big one for me.
Fantastic. And Mike, anything to add to those?
It's hard to go last when it's just one thing. If I had to point at a single thing, getting evaluation right at scale is the biggest scale limiter. But I would have also added just making sure to get this, as Jan said, safely in the hands of people to experiment. Because to Sonia's point, you have to make sure you're asking good questions. But a lot of times we're solving problems in complex, sticky areas. And so knowing what questions to ask sometimes takes a little bit of experimentation and exposure to what the tools can do.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Mike Ross from Bank of New York, Sonia Crosby from QBE. and Jan Newman from Comcast. It's John Ratson from Accenture. Thanks so much for the time, and back to you.